who is going to reflect on Peter's presentation, but also talk broadly about biodiversity issues. I think we are very strong on land in this panel, but perhaps not so strong on biodiversity issues. Prof. Erasmus, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Utumile.
Thank you. I was just giving the rundown to the other co-speakers that are here.
Thanks. Hi, colleagues. Good to meet you.
Hi, Prof. Nice meeting you, Prof.
Nice meeting you.
Thanks.
All right. So maybe I'll take it from the top. Peter, you've had the song, but bear with me.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
All right. So the webinar is going to be really not too formal event, if I can put it that way. We are trying to get a conversation going, and we are therefore going to begin with Prof. Lindiwe Spanda presenting an overview of the CLAB project, of some of the dialogues that we have convened and what has come out of there, and then bringing it in now to this land degradation and biodiversity one. She's going to invite a colleague from the United Nations Environment Programme to give his opening remarks. Unfortunately, we've not been able to get in touch with him today, so it's possible he might not join us. If he doesn't join, she's just going to move straight to a colleague from the UNECA Land Policy Initiative, who's going to reflect on her work and also just share current thinking around the topic. She has been given specific questions to address. Okay. After which, we will then get into a presentation by Peter, which is going to be a 15-minute presentation of the CLAB thematic draft that was shared with all of you and also with the participants. He's going to touch the key highlights of that thematic brief. We will then have Prof. Erasmus coming in to do the reflections on the presentation, but also to speak broadly on the theme. Prof, I was just mentioning that we are very strong on land because Peter and Dinko are land people, but not so much maybe on the biodiversity component. And I think that's where we would really rely on you to bring that out quite strongly.
Perfect.
Thank you. After your presentation, we are going to then go to Dinko, who is going to share with us some of the work that he has been doing around land conflict issues in Ghana, but maybe also speaking broadly around his research interests on land policies. Then we are then going to open it to the floor. I will be monitoring the questions that are coming through the chat. And if there are specific ones for any of the speakers, I will quickly shoot them to you in the chat so that you are able to have a look at them and then respond. We hope that we would have about 15 minutes for an open discussion with participants. And then at the end, I'll then come back to all the speakers to give final reflections based on the discussions of the webinar. And then hand over to Professor Spanda to then bring everything to a close and explain about the way forward after that. Welcome, Prof. Spanda.
Thank you.
Thank you. Meet our panelists, speakers. We have Peter, who's going to do the presentation. We have Dinko, who is doing the panel after the presentation. We have Prof. Erasmus, whom you know. And we are waiting now for our colleague from UNECA. I'll just try and chase her up and hopefully she joins before we begin.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Lindiwe. Just to give you a sort of a heads up and maybe your colleagues as well, my comments are sort of broad comments on what we've learned in the Ipes land degradation restoration assessment project. So sort of kind of the five lessons we've learned from it. It's not so much the individual findings. I'll here and there refer to a finding. Then I've got a bit of a broader section where I unpack I think disease is on the agenda about land and biodiversity and disease. So I'll unpack that in a little bit more detail with one or two recent papers. And then at the end, I've got a section on which I think the costs and the solutions to get to better restoration solutions. So just kind of as a kickstarter, quite broad here and there specifics, but not digging into too much of the hairy detail.
Can we rely on you, Prof. Erasmus, to pick up from where UNEP would have left in terms of just mopping up why is biodiversity at times a preserve of the few? Why isn't it a people's agenda?
Right. Let me see if I can add that. So that's just before I start.
Yes, as an intro, because I think people are a bit afraid of the subject.
Sure.
Yep.
Do that,
Yep.
no problem.
Yep. Colleagues, welcome. Thank you so much for making time to join us. We have 4 minutes before they open up to the public. We've been running into 200s for registration. For this one, it's 75. So I want to believe it's partly because everyone's like biodiversity, land. Okay, what's my stake in that? So let's make them believe they have a stake and beef in the process.
Deka has joined us. Welcome,
Good.
Deka.
Good afternoon, Timbe. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm sorry to join a little bit late.
That's okay. We're excited we have you. So I'm going to moderate the first session where you are going to be speaking. And the whole idea is to just find out in terms of UNEP, your processes, what does this subject mean to you? Where are you? And what are the major positions that UNEP has taken and the expectations in your roadmap?
Excellent, well noted. So I'm just from UNECA, Economic Commission for Africa of the United Nations.
Yep.
So I will just take it under the angle with biodiversity and finance, if you are okay.
Excellent. Are you reading a speech or you want it to be interactive?
Well, it will be good if it's interactive. So
yeah, that's how we want it. It's the UNEP representative who's going to give opening remarks, isn't it, Tembi?
Yes, but unfortunately, we have not been able to locate him, so he might not join on time. So I
All
think
right,
we
so
move on.
so Deka, once I introduce you, I think let's go into an interactive process, just addressing the questions: why is land restoration and biodiversity important to you and your organization? What are you doing in this space? And what are the innovations that you believe should be upscaled, right?
okay.
Yeah.
If just for information, I have a flight. I will need to leave in 20 minutes. So
that's okay. We're starting with you. So once we are done, we won't come back to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll start with our cameras all on so that they can do a group photo, and then move on then to the main presentation. We have 1 minute, so I'll be quiet.
Okay, everyone, may we please have our cameras on, Sheila and Tembi? Thank you. So I pick the photograph now. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I will just cut my camera because the bandwidth is a little bit limited.
Okay. We are on the hour. I hope our participants have all been let in.
Yes, Prof. Sebanda.
And we are recording this whole series.
And we are also live on Facebook.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We believe we should start on time. There is a recording that is going on. You can revisit all the series that we have had. Welcome to the fourth and final segment of the thematic webinars being convened by Future Africa in partnership with the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and in partnership with FANAPAN. My name is Lindiwe Majele Sibanda. I'm speaking with you from the University of Pretoria, Future Africa campus. We're excited because we are on a journey that has taken us to take a deep dive on the impact of climate change on food systems. We then went on to look at the impact of climate change on land, water, and energy. We also looked at climate change and One Health. In this final segment, we are please mute. We are looking at the impact of climate change on land and biodiversity. I want to believe that we all have a stake on the issue of land. Healthy soils, healthy and productive land resources cut across the soils we have, water, and biodiversity. These are the foundations of our societies, the foundations of our economies. In recent decades, land resources have been subject to persistent degradation and loss due to global patterns of human domination and what we call development. An estimated 20% of Africa's soils is degraded owing or as a result of soil erosion, salinization, pollution, and loss of vegetation and soil fertility. In this segment, we want to understand what should Africa be doing. We want to understand in terms of innovations, what should we be upscaling? But most important, we want to understand in terms of creating a conducive policy environment, what policies are required at national, regional, and global levels. I'm excited today because we're starting off with a strong panel whose bread and butter is to deal with these issues of land and biodiversity. They're going to help us unpack the issue of land restoration and biodiversity and why it's important for all of us. They'll share with us what their own organizations are doing and what innovations they've seen. Please, why we should care about the issue of land and biodiversity. As you can see, it's an important topic and we all need to be part of it. As we have done in all past segments, we're going to start with a conversation where we talk to an expert in the area, where we unpack what they do, what they believe we should all do, and then go to a presentation where we have shared with you a thematic brief that has been written by a team of experts, but needs to be beefed up so that we can condense it into a policy brief. We're going to have a special commentary by an expert, Professor Barron Erasmus from the University of Pretoria, who will take us to his own world of research and his world as an expert globally on what is happening and what Africa should be mindful of. We'll then move on to a panel reflection. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar. Let me introduce our first panelist, who is going to be Ms. Deka Musa Rague, who is coming in as a senior regional advisor for National Capital Economic Commission, ACA. She holds a PhD in process and environmental engineering. She's also got a master's degree in pharmaceutical and chemical processes and in powder processes. Prior to joining UNECA, Ms. Deka worked with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, the government of Djibouti, in different ministerial departments and in the private sector. She has more than 14 years of multidisciplinary corporate and public sector management experience, notably in natural resources management. Welcome, Deka, and please share with us, why are you so passionate on the subject of land and biodiversity? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lindiwe. It's a pleasure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to join you today. Thank you for the invitation. And I would like just to share maybe a word on why biodiversity and nature is really important for me. Well, I'm working now on a new frontier between finance and nature. And why it is really, the answer is really simple. I can start with a blank statement. Could you imagine that over 60% of our continent's GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature? And yet between 1970 and 2016, the last decades, the natural capital stock of our African countries actually declined by the same rate, more than 60% on average. And still today, the associated risk to nature are still valued at around zero. So despite this emerging thinking, many of African countries' development priorities or challenges have not been appropriately integrating nature and natural capital in their strategy. So today, valuing nature risk at zero is no longer, I would say, acceptable. And we need to develop some concept instrument that could help us taking in account the most valuable thing we have, which is our biodiversity and our nature. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you very much. So we are keen to understand, what is your organization doing? What does ECA do? Why do they care about land and biodiversity, and who are their constituencies?
Well, thank you very much. And I can say that the Economic Commission for Africa is working on a number of avenues or subjects directly related to the land restoration or biodiversity. I will maybe just mention the one I'm working on, which is paving the way towards taking nature-related risks and opportunities in account, which as I said, they are currently at zero, and it is no longer possible.
So who are your partners in that program, and how do you go about implementation?
Well, we are working now with the new global task force, which is the task force on nature-related financial disclosure, and also FSD Africa, which is financial sector deepening Africa. And I can maybe mention this groundwork we started together. We explore nature-related financial risk, as I said, but also impact and opportunities for countries. And we hope to benefit from these studies to contribute to establish at country level, some nature frameworks that could feed policies in order to contribute to give a tangible roadmap for future actions in protecting biodiversity and restoring land and more largely our ecosystems and nature.
Thank you very much. So in terms of financing, where are the resources coming from? You mentioned that you're doing this at regional with global partners, but at the end of the day, implementation has to be bottom up at country level. What sort of resources have been mobilized, and what are we looking at in terms of a financial envelope?
Well, the work we are doing will help us to channel more financial flows toward the subject I just mentioned. And the idea is that we would like to capitalize on the financial instruments already developed by the UNECA, which are the green bonds or the sustainable bonds, but also try to develop some nature performance related bonds that will help us to channel the global financial flows dedicated for adaptation or mitigation, more specifically for nature protection.
Excellent. So in terms of innovations, what are you seeing in the landscape that you believe should be scaled up for Africa to make good the damage that's been caused?
Well, could you please just repeat? I'm not sure that
Are there any key innovations that you are seeing that can be taken to scale?
Well, at the financial level, I would say that the new instrument that I just mentioned, which could be some bonds that are nature related, and where investors, they can be from public sector or private sector, would be taken for responsible of the nature degradation that their activities could induce, are key for the work we are doing now, leading now.
Excellent. So financing arrangements, there could be some innovative ways of mobilizing resources, and that's one model that you're exploring, correct? Exactly. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you very much for sharing that brief on what you're doing. And we would like to understand deeper, but more important, to see how we can unpack that model for use in different countries. So we hope we can stay connected and that you can feed into different processes as we walk towards creating a conducive environment for land restoration and biodiversity. Thank you so much for your time. We want to go now to UNEP representative, Mr. Levi Kagavi, who's going to share with us, just like we have heard from ECA, what they are doing as UNEP, and in his capacity as Africa Coordinator, Ecosystems and Biodiversity Programs, what are the programs that the United Nations Environment Programme is pursuing, and why should we care about those programs in our journey of finding innovations? Over to you, Mr. Kavaki. Mr. Levy, are you able to put your camera on?
Prof. Spanda, Mr. Levy is not in the room as yet. Perhaps we can.
He had joined, I think his line dropped. So okay. we will move on and maybe have our presentation. He can come afterwards. So let's move now to the main presentation. Let me introduce Dr. Peter Asare Nwama, who is going to share with us the thematic brief that you all received. He is not the author, but he is a trusted messenger who is volunteered to be the spokesperson of the message. So we are going to go through this, and then we will reflect on what is missing, what should we add on, and what is the best position in terms of innovations for upscaling. Over to you, Dr. Asare Nwama.
Thank you very much, Professor Sibanda. And I'm glad that I've been invited to give this presentation. So let me start sharing my screen so that okay, so we are going to look at land restoration and biodiversity with a focus on Africa. The outline of the presentation will look at the general problem of land issues in Africa and how or why we have to restore and the essence of biodiversity within these nations. Then we also look at the governance frameworks or initiatives that are currently existing at the global and then at African level. Then we come back to what innovative ways can we implement, or what new things can be done, or what old things that are likely to restore our environment or the land can be implemented and scaled up to ensure that Africa can restore its degraded land. We come up with conclusions. So my presentation will start with the issue of climate change. Climate change is a global phenomenon, and then African economies are hardly hit. We are hit hard by climate change because we live in a vulnerable environment where we depend on agriculture and other climate resilient, climate sensitive sectors as the basic of our economies. And as climate change has a toll on agriculture, which is the backbone of our economy, smallholder farmers are struggling How do they catch up with feeding the African continent? How do they catch up with feeding the rising population? So the essence is that farmers are in a haste to come up with innovative ways or ways of catching up, producing to meet the requirements of Africans' food consumption. By doing that, they have to expand their access to land. They have to farm on more lands, and this has implications on degradation of lands. More so, climate change too also affects Africans' land. So this dynamic of climate change, the need for Africa to be food secure, it poses a question of what is the impact on our land resources and biodiversity, and what can we do? When you read a lot of studies, they look at the different facets of factors that affect degradation in Africa, and it is important we delve into this to understand the different factors, because if we want to address them, then we have to look at individual components that contribute to degradation. As I indicated earlier, in Africa, to address some of the issues of land degradation, we have regional-based initiatives such as the African Adaptation Initiative, which was implemented or adopted in 2015. And the essence is, how do the 54 African countries come together to pool resources, to pool capacity, and to address land degradation in Africa? This, since 2015, has been implemented, but the monitoring and evaluation and then the outcome is something that is not available to everybody. It is important we look at that and look at how African economies, African continents, and countries are actually achieving the objective of the African Adaptation Initiative. Another aspect is the Green Wall, the Great Green Wall, which seeks to build the plantation of green environment all the way from West Africa all through to southern the Sahel, from Senegal to Djibouti. This is very ambitious, but it is very important if you want to restore our land. In all these frameworks, one challenge or one would ask, do African governments have the resources? Are there existing regulatory frameworks that will help them to implement this? And even our own governance systems and political environments, do they have the political will? These are questions that as scholars and as people who have interest in restoring our land, we have to look at it. Within this framework, to outside this framework, the United Nations Convention to combat desertification is also there. And we all know the essence is how is UN contributing to the fight against drought, the fight against desertification. And these initiatives are very good, but still comes to the issue of access to funds for Africans to implement any of their plans. But that notwithstanding, there are a lot, or there are existing innovative ways that Africans from the local level all through to national and regional level can implement to ensure that we can, in a way or in a positive way, address our food insecurity whilst making our environment green by restoring their lands. So one way is the micro garden system. The micro garden techniques has gained popularity in Africa, especially in West Africa, because as I speak, even in my house, I've started it. It is something that smallholder households or every household is making an attempt of not relying strictly on what is on the market, but how do their household fend for themselves? What kind of, in terms of vegetable, in terms of access to vegetables, it is not always the case that Africans will have to go to the market, but we can also help to reduce access to the market by providing for ourselves. So with the micro garden, it's a household or backyard farming system where household use household compost, household waste, and that can be degraded to make sure that they have quality access to soil that will enhance the growth of plants, such as vegetables. There are a lot of documentaries across Africa where households are preparing their own compost or vermicompost because of this innovative way. And by doing that, what we are saying is that we are not relying strictly on agrochemicals that may increase production on the farm, but may have impact on land and microorganisms. So when we introduce micro gardens at the basis to African farmers, to even non-farmers, because it has to be accepted by non-farmers, the idea is that we are gradually creeping into our system how households can be food resilient in planting their own food. The second, and it is quite indigenous in the sense that has been with African smallholder farmers for quite a long time, which is fallow planting or fallow season. This is a system where African farmers have to leave a piece of land for a particular period of time, take another one, and come back to it after it has been restored. And by process or by doing so, they are indirectly restoring the land, the fertility of the land, making sure that they're able to control erosion, making sure that microorganism activities are increased in that particular piece of land. And by doing that, they're able to enhance and increase productivity because the soil is improved, erosion which degrades and reduces the ability of the soil to provide for crops are also reduced. So planting fallow is something that we should continue to encourage smallholder farmers to go into. But one question one would ask is, if farmers are supposed to go into the fallow system, it comes with issues of access to land. A farmer has one specific access to land throughout the year. How do they follow? These are things that if we want to look for innovative, we have to delve into it more to look for solutions from the fallowing system that is more effective and efficient for the smallholder farmer. From there, we look at indigenous ways of doing things and how they can be infused into policies at local and then regional and even international level. It is important for us to know that all the African farmers complain that their voices are not heard in policy process or on the policy table, and this is problematic because they are the ones who are making all these policies and strategies for, and they have a chunk of knowledge that they have taken them years for them to acquire. And if we want to address it, we have to bring them on board on the policy table. What innovative ways, what local indigenous knowledge are existing at the local level? How can we tap into them and apply them, combining with science? Because when local indigenous knowledge comes with science, I tell you, the output is very great. So indigenous or integrating indigenous systems into our land policies, planning at all levels is very important. We could see in West Africa, in Ghana, in Mali, especially in the case of Mali, there has been a means for government to integrate traditional practices into land reform, but it has not been positive. We have to delve into what caused this not to be positive. What were the challenges and how can other African countries scale up to make sure that indigenous practices are important part of our daily life. Sometimes because of globalization, we may look down upon them, but they are very important if we want the smallholder farming community and want Africa to be food resilient. Agricultural land reforms is also another innovative way, so another thing that has to be done to make sure we can restore our lands. African economies in Africa, in Ghana, in South Africa, land grabbing is becoming a big issue, and access to land is being the government's ability to control access, tenure, and ownership of land is quite restricted, especially in Ghana. It looks more like a free range where if you have the financial means, you can have access to land. But it is important we begin to think as a continent, how do we reform our land system? How do we ensure that the ownership of land comes with responsibilities to make sure we are restoring the land and not degrading it? Because in many aspects of our environment, once somebody has access to land, it is always assumed that they have the responsibility to do whatever they want. But that is not the case. It is because the African governments or African government have been so relaxed. We have to look at how we are going to make sure that all reforms for land are purpose for the protection of the land, and not just because we want to expand our base, not just because we want to expand our economic access to funds, but we have to make sure in all these reforms, how do we conserve and protect our land? That should be our core priority as Africans if we want to restore our land, because we know that we Africans have the land, but who owns the land? How do people have access to? How do people use the land? All these are key things that have to be considered in our reform to make sure that our land benefits the African people and enhances African growth and development. The fifth innovative way of reducing degradation is what we call conservation agriculture. It comes with three main principles. First of all, as a farmer, you should cause minimal tillage. By tillage, we mean you should not disturb the land, because by disturbing the land, the fertility of the land is affected, erosion is increased on the land. So if we minimize tillage, what we are doing is that we are indirectly conserving the fertility of the land for nature. Another thing is that in conservation agriculture, we have to make sure we mix crops, different varieties of crops, because different crops have different nutrient requirements. And for instance, if we have cashew, or we have cashew and beans, or we have maize and beans planted on the same piece of land, the idea is that one plant will require the output of the other. Maize or legumes crops are always nitrogen fixing crops, and they add more nitrogen to the soil, whilst others will also add sulfur, phosphorus and others. So it is important that in the framework of conservation agriculture, we think of improving or scaling up mixed farming, mixed system of cropping, where each crop supports each other for productivity. The other aspect is mulching, where farmers, the practice of slash and burning should be minimized to the optimum level, because they affect the biodiversity, they affect the fertility of soil, and they make it very difficult for the African farmer to increase yield. Once we burn, we affect the nutrient component of the soil. So by mulching up to, I learned in Zimbabwe, they mulch up to 30%, 30 centimeters, to make sure that the mulch can conserve and preserve the fertility of the soil. Over there, they have crept in a more way of traditional meaning, where they say mulch, since it's also synonymous to the eye cover of the law of Lord, which means the Lord is protecting the soil for fertility. So in conservation agriculture, these three key principles are very important if we want to make sure we restore our lands whilst enhancing productivity for Africans' food security. From there, we move on to agroforestry. Currently, I must say, next week on the 5th is what we call the World Environmental Day. And in Ghana, the government is supporting small scale and other factories, other companies that are into the production of agroforestry products, planting of seeds, planting of plants, to make sure that we can scale up the production and the plantation of such, because it is important. Agroforestry, whilst providing income to those who are into the production of agroforestry trees such as timber, cashew, cocoa, whatsoever, they also helps in the conservation of African lands by providing a land cover, by ensuring that fertility of the soil is enhanced, by avoiding or minimizing erosion. So agroforestry within the conservation and climate smart agriculture has become an important requirement, even recommended by the Food and Agriculture Organization to government, that if governments wants to achieve, or if governments in Africa wants to address the issue of climate change and enhance their productivity whilst protecting the environment, because these are the three key things we look at: productivity, protecting the environment, and enhancing our food security. So if we want to achieve this three balance, there should be a balance. And agroforestry offers us that opportunity by planting plants at degraded areas. They help to reduce erosion, they help to conserve the environment, they help to protect the soil and the land from excessive exposure to sun rays, thereby protecting it and making it fruitful, making it fertile for agricultural productivity. And we, as I emphasize, if governments want to increase it, then they must partner with private entities that are already into the production of agroforestry. In the case of Ghana, under the Alternative Livelihood and Employment Initiative of the government of Ghana, currently there is a farm in East Africa, Eastern Ghana, where they have over 20,000 seedlings to provide for the government. For next week, the government aims to plant over 20 million plants across the country on the 5th of June. So this is something that as government, as individuals, we must motivate our people, because if we don't conserve, if we don't protect our lands, the impact will come back to Africans and not to any other person. The seventh innovative way of conserving our land system is through integrative agriculture, where we integrate crop and livestock. This is very important. Crops depend on fodder or plants for their, livestock depend on fodder, that is the plant for their feed. And to enhance fertility of the soil, manure from livestock can also enhance soil fertility. So by integrating crop livestock into a farming system, the idea is that the farmer is balancing the output from crops and giving it to livestock, and the output from livestock, which may be a waste to somebody, may become an important factor in the production of crops. So this calls for the need for enhanced education. We have to gradually and progressively educate our farmers of the need for integrative crop and livestock production system where they can rely, because if a farmer wants to increase productivity right now, the main idea is fertilizer. These fertilizers have impact on the soil, which may affect the idea of the farmer enhancing productivity. But organic manure produced from the waste, cow dung, from chicken droppings can substantially enhance the fertility of the soil, thereby helping the farmer to increase growth, increase income, and increase productivity. On the basis of this, there are a lot of innovative ways that the African people can take to make sure that we restore our lands whilst enhancing our food security and our own development. Because you must not forget, across Africa, the economy is agrarian, and we have to depend on agricultural transformation for our development. So it is important we look for what innovative ways can we ensure our productivity whilst protecting our forests and the natural resources. It is also important for us to look at innovative ways of financing this, because without funds, the knowledge will stay on papers. Without funds, most of these ideas will stay on papers. The smallholder farmer has to have access to essential resources to boost their capacity to respond to climate change. And governments across the continent should make sure they look for innovative ways, partner with private sector entities to provide access to funds for smallholder farmers. And then another thing is we have to look at our land reforms robustly as a continent. How do we ensure that our land reforms are sustainable in the sense that they are helping us in driving food security and agricultural productivity whilst conserving our environment? So I'll end here by saying that we have the zeal. Africans have the capacity. It is up to us to put into practice most of these practices so that we can conserve our ecosystem, protect biodiversity, and enhance our development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter Asare Noama. We couldn't have found a better messenger for this message. We chose you because you're young. You've been selected amongst 20 global youth leaders for the Young Scientists Group of the FAO and the World Food Forum. You've also been devoting a lot of time into building capacity of farmers on sustainable production systems, both at national, you're so passionate about your Ghana, and continent-wide through PAFO, the Pan-African Farmers Organization. We are aware that you're already holding a position of building capacity as a lecturer at the University of Environment and Sustainable Development in Ghana. Thank you very much for being a passionate messenger for this message.
Thank you
Colleagues,
very
can
much.
we all put our cameras on? Our team would like to see who is who in the room before we open up for comments and a commentary. If you are able to, please have your camera on for just 30 seconds and we'll be done. Thank you. I see the cameras are coming on. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. We now move on to the reflections. You got the thematic brief because we wanted you to review those innovations, the 7 of them that have been highlighted. Most of those are not new, but the problem we've had is that they are never taken to scale. They are always implemented piecemeal, and we want to reflect as Africans in terms of what will it take to take this to scale, and who should be the messengers who look at the architecture of the combination of innovations, ground truthing them, science proofing them, and financing mechanisms to take this to scale. I'll now like to invite Professor Barron Erasmus, who will take us through a reflection of what we've had and his own world in terms of the initiatives that he's leading and the partnerships he's engaged with. Over to you, Professor Erasmus.
Thank you very much, Professor Sibanda. Let me get my video going as well. There we go. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you very much everyone attending. I think we've this is actually quite an auspicious timing of the whole CLAB, the whole CLAB seminar event series. Those of you that are tracking this, later this week, 2nd and 3rd of June, is the Stockholm Plus 50 discussions going on. And the theme for Stockholm Plus 50 is a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility, our opportunity. And this is one of the shall we say, the pivotal global discussions that's happened in a large number of countries. Have a look at the website to sort of think about beyond the SDGs. What comes next? How many SDGs have we met? Which ones are which ones are still ongoing? Well, actually, all of them are still ongoing. Most of them are quite ambitious. Bottom line is, this is the next type of thinking about sustainability in general. I think the theme here, a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility, our opportunity, actually touches on 4 important things. It's about the health of the environment, it's about well-being and thriving people, it's about who needs to do it, and it decides the opportunity to actually make it work. In a way that actually speaks to a lot of the themes that's popping up, not just today, but also in the previous 3 CLAB seminars. I think this transition from thinking about opportunity and thinking about responsibility and thriving people with a healthy planet as an enabler also reflects the change in the last 20 years around what we think about sustainability. I mean, I still remember the Millennium Development Goals. I remember all the concepts around ecosystem services, natural capital, payment for ecosystem services, with biodiversity as the underlying capital, shall we say. All those ideas, and I'm presenting here in a linear fashion, because I'd like to get the timeline going. But of course, there's many different permutations and loops and reflective feedbacks that led to these different concepts. And more recently, that gamut of ideas mixed in with the SDGs led to some newer concepts around nature's benefits to people, nature-based solutions, and most recently, certainly as far as I know, called nature-based development, which means we still, this most recent way of thinking sort of puts the development, thriving, well-being, getting ahead in the context of nature, and recognizing that these 2 things are not just intertwined, but the one can enable the other. Back to today's discussion, where does this leave us with biodiversity and restoration? I've got 4 main observations sort of in general about restoration, degradation. And in one of those observations, I'll speak in detail a little bit more about what I think these definitions are. And I'll circle around to biodiversity. And then to point number 3, I'm going to have a bit of a detour into disease, because in this almost post-COVID era, let's hope that's the case, the idea of degradation and land and disease transfer and emergent diseases is front and center. So I'll spend a little bit of time there and actually take our focus off COVID and show you how much of this has been happening all around us that we just haven't been aware of. So that'll be around my 3rd point, and right at the end, I'll have some general comments around costs and solutions. So the solutions right at the end. Right, so first off, when we think about restoration, we also need to think about degradation. But one man's degradation, or one woman's degradation, is another man or woman's restoration. I mean, if we all look at the same, let's say, a maize field, right? So if you're a farmer looking at a maize field, you can look at it, and it might have, you can look at the vigor of the plants and the greenness of the leaves and how straight the rows are, and that might be something that appeals to you as a farmer. If you're a wilderness activist, you can think of a maize field, and you'll be filled with ideas of loss and lack of biodiversity and a homogeneous, sterile ecosystem. If you're an agricultural economist, you can think of profit, and you can think of the upcoming harvest, and you can think of what that can do. And so I can carry on, but you get the sense that this is not an absolute. And for that reason, there's been quite a lot of work going in, especially in the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, Ipes, to define what we think about degradation and restoration. And I think the most important part here is that degradation, they defined as a persistent loss of productivity, services, and biodiversity. So any change, a delta, in productivity, services, and biodiversity is a form of degradation. This means that, according to that definition, pretty much the entire world is degraded. And that is indeed the definition that has been applied in most of the Ipes, or actually all the Ipes assessments. So it also forces us to think about what degradation has happened according to a particular service. So if we think about a production ecosystem service, right? So let's just think about the volume of maize production. A well-kept, watered, irrigated maize field will be in a better state than a maize field which is rain-fed and maybe not as well looked after or weeded. The one produces more and the other one produces less. But in both those cases, you end up with a system that has been transformed from a natural state. So the idea is that we think about transformation as a change in the land cover. In other words, we go from a natural state, savannas and trees and grass, to a different state, in other words, a maize field, just as an example. That by itself is not degraded, but there's been a delta. There's been a change in the production, a change in the ecosystem service. And then when we look at the maize field, then we can decide whether is that a good maize field, it's one that's been degraded, or is it some maize field that we can actually restore to be even more productive. But remember, we're not defining this in terms of a particular ecosystem service, in this case, production. But there's a multitude of other ecosystem services as well. Water quality, water retention, pollution abatement, air quality, and a number of others. I'm just using this as an example. So that's the first conceptual idea that we need to become quite clear in our minds. What we think about degradation and restoration, and what do we think about transformation? What I'm proposing here is a transformation as a complete change in the land cover. The examples from a natural system to a production system, and then a particular production system or a particular natural system can then be degraded and by definition also be restored to its previous state. And why this is also useful, because then it gets around the whole argument of it's impossible to restore Earth because humans have been here for the last 20,000 years and we have substantially changed our environment. Of course we have. That doesn't mean that everything everything has to be restored and the reference natural state is 20,000 years ago. That's not reasonable. So the idea of restoration around a particular service and degradation around a particular service allows us to work around this concept of what do we want to restore it to. That's an important concept. That's the first one. Second concept around degradation and restoration that I'd like to talk to is this idea that it only applies to African drylands. So certainly with the UNCCD, this is one of the outcomes. Very well, definitions apply to African drylands. But as a result, certainly for a lot of the global north, that meant that degradation becomes a faraway problem. It's those people in Africa that degrade their drylands, and the problem is only over there. And you can carry on with this way of thinking. You don't need to be a political activist to understand that this is a global north, global south view from a few years ago. But it's perceived as a degradation as something that happens in Africa. It's mostly of their own making, right? The Africans do it to themselves, and therefore they need to solve it themselves. And of course, we know this is not the case. We know that degradation occurs in all ecosystems. It occurs worldwide. Some of it happens gradual. Some of it happened long ago. Or the loss in services are substituted from elsewhere. And that's why people don't really notice it. So we know that, let's say, a typical European country, let's say Western Europe, let's take an example, Germany, highly degraded environment. If we use a natural state as a reference. But the changes that have happened over a long period of time, and those lost services have been substituted from elsewhere. And now there's a new cultural landscape that produces a different bundle of ecosystem services that reflects the aspirations of people living there now. We're not going to restore all of Germany back to what the Schwarzwald looked like 10,000 years ago. That's not the intention. So take-home point second is that degradation occurs in all, the degradation occurred in all ecosystems. And it means that worldwide restoration is one of the primary mechanisms by which we can unlock the value that lies in intact natural environments. That's my second point. The third point here is I think that we need to frame land degradation and restoration as having important international causes and consequences as well as local ones, right? So this links with my previous point. It is not just a case of degradation, which is an in situ, a particular farmer, a particular area that's been degraded. If we look at the global markets with our previous definitions of degradation and transformation, these teleconnections are extremely important. So a lot of the degradation, and actually the opportunities for restoration, but let's stay with the degradation. A lot of the degradation has resulted from the export of demand. global trade, and the unintended consequences of policies in one region or another. Right? And the consequences of degradation are also typically exported to communities around this, around areas where degradation happened: dust, pollution, novel disease, climate impacts, and desperate people that no longer have the livelihoods they used to have. This doesn't mean that we absolve ourselves of the responsibility of local land stewardship, but it does mean that it's not just a local issue where local actions result in local consequences. It means that you've got global drivers of trade, global drivers of economies affecting degradation in one area, and this degradation then has consequences local and globally. There's an interesting factoid here, and the reference, I can give you the reference. It's a number of them actually, but the estimate in the IPBES land degradation restoration assessment estimates that between a quarter and a half of the environmental impacts of consumption specifically are felt in parts of the world other than where the consumption occurred. Right? So, I mean, we know this, but this half to a quarter, I think, is a really interesting stat. So the fact that we produce, let's say, food in one part of the world, it's consumed in another part of the world, the impact of that consumption is not felt where it's actually consumed. Quite like that number. I'd like to spend a little bit of time here when we talk about teleconnections and impacts in other parts of the world, thinking about disease. So obviously we think about emerging zoonotic diseases, COVID-19 as the one which is obviously with us. But if we look at since 1918, there's been 29 viral zoonotic diseases that emerged that caused more than 10 deaths globally. And we've also seen that there's been a steady increase in the cost in terms of the economic cost as well as lives lost for zoonotic pandemics over the last century. So at the moment, we read quite a lot about COVID responses, and we find statements from prominent policymakers that argue the best way to address future pandemic catastrophes is to include or to improve our ability to detect and contain emerging zoonotic threats. Sure, detection and containment is one of them, but I'd like to argue that there's much more preventative work that we can do beforehand. So if we can limit the contact of potential zoonotic diseases with humans, then we're actually doing very important preventative work beforehand. So, so there's basically three ways in which to do this. The one is better surveillance of pathogens and the spillover, development of or better management of the wildlife trade, and a substantial reduction of deforestation. Right, so there's a surveillance component, there's the wildlife trade component, and there's deforestation component. Together, the costs of these three pandemic prevention activities is less than 1/20th of the value of lives lost each year to emerging viral zoonoses. Right, so this is not COVID specific. This is all the viral zoonoses of the last century, since 1918. To prevent it is much more expensive, is a lot less expensive, 20 times less expensive than just to cope with the disease once it emerges. And how do we prevent it? We prevent it by managing wildlife trade and deforestation. So of deforestation is arguably the leading driver of this pathogen emergence. And obviously we know also one of the largest threats to biodiversity loss in the world. So deforestation in the tropics particularly brings people into contact with animals as they enter forests to clear them for timber, for agriculture, for roads, for mining. And we know that past zoonotic disease emergence have been closely tied to deforestation. So here we have an action. If we can bring back forests, restore them, avoid degrading them in the first place, those two actions together, we actually have massive co-benefits in terms of avoiding the impacts of avoiding pandemics altogether. And then I haven't even started mentioning the co-benefits. So we know that halting deforestation and restoring lands is one of the best ways to have a multiple co-benefits to people not just living in those environments, but also through these teleconnections that I mentioned. So one action to prevent disease, halting deforestation, managing wildlife trade, it's got all these other co-benefits for multiple other spheres of activity, also for climate change, which is probably the most important one. So why would we not do that? Right, so that was my third point. Third observation was around teleconnections, and the globalized nature of degradation impact and restoration opportunities. And here I talk a little bit about disease. Fourth point I'd like to make is around indigenous knowledge. Interesting, again, from the IPBES LDRA assessment, very interesting discussions that came up. And I wouldn't say that particular assessment dealt with indigenous and local knowledge comprehensively, but we made a good effort. And I think subsequent assessments have done a much better job of it. The assessment that I was involved in, I think one of the most important parts here is that certainly struck me is that not just referring to indigenous knowledge, but referring to indigenous and local knowledge. This knowledge, in situ, context-specific, nuanced, is something that is rapidly developing. It's something that's the amalgamation of ancestral knowledge, of experience in the environment, and through globalization, access through the internet, through mobile devices, and wherever people get the information from. So almost I started using the term ILK, indigenous and local knowledge together, because actually, certainly at that stage, it was almost impossible untangling these different sources of knowledge. I've found that quite interesting. Second last point is generally around costs, and then I'll move on to some broad suggested solutions. Around costs, well, here's interesting numbers. The hidden costs of global land degradation amount to about 10% of annual global gross product. Interesting number. Obvious opportunities here for restoration if we can get out of the local global scale conundrum. Another interesting factoid, there's three of them here. Halting and reversing land degradation can provide more than a third of the most cost-effective greenhouse gas mitigation activities to keep global warming under 2 degrees. So we can meet 2 degrees of global mitigation targets. Sorry, we can meet a third of global mitigation targets through land restoration activities and halting degradation. Third interesting factoid. The benefits of restoration exceeds the costs by an average margin of 10-1. So it's 10 times more efficient to avoid the degradation and to restore than it is to actually have the degradation and then cope with that consequences. And there's multiple benefits, right? So some of the benefits in the different studies that popped up here: increased employment, increased business and household spending, improved gender equity, increased local investment, also investment in education, among others. Lots of benefits here. So those are three interesting factoids just to get us thinking about the costs. In summary, solution, how do we go ahead? And of course, the key here, as far as I'm concerned, is scale and context and local nuance. How do you take actions that fundamentally need to happen at the scale of the individual farm, and how do you replicate that across enough farms to end up with enough of an impact to actually get the broad regional benefits that we want? In my mind, that's a function of policy coordination between different ministries, right? So you end up with those ministries that are responsible for sustainable production, also the ones that are responsible for consumption and globalization and market forces. They need to talk to each other and understand the real costs and benefits. First. Second one is linked to that one. We get lots of what I call perverse incentives that actually promote land degradation, and that needs to be turned around. So we actually promote positive incentives that reward sustainable land management. Tricky thing there is if you've got a maximizing profit approach, then you will always come up short here with short-term cost estimates. It's about that inclusive internalizing the usually externalized costs in these calculations. Very interesting challenge. And then there's all of these are coupled to monitoring and the verification systems to sort of make sure that the benefits do accrue in the way that you want. And then I think maybe in the context, just to wrap up, my last comment, last point on this comment is I think that it's deliberate that the CLAB initiative has got the C, the L, the A, and the B in it, because if we can actually integrate the agriculture, the forestry, the energy, the water, the infrastructure, and the service agendas, we start unlocking the co-benefits and the multiplication factor of these opportunities. Professor Banda, I think that was my general observations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Erasmus. We could have gone on to listen to the 4 points that you raised and how you expound on them. But the bottom line is the how. We hear what can be done, but so what is it that we need to make that compelling case? I like the way you quantified the cost of not doing business in terms of the lives that are lost. And the question I had was, can we package that in a scarier form? How do you quantify loss of life into, I'm sure there are metrics you can use, but we still don't have that compelling oomph that gets policymakers to work, particularly when it comes to land restoration and biodiversity. So have you seen any key innovations that sort of stand out and become the big pool? I mean, I've heard a lot said about the Great Green Wall, but I'm still waiting to see how the money will land on the table, how the policies that support that will be put in place, how we can look back 10, 20 years later and say, yes, we believed, we invested, we implemented, here are the results. What to you, particularly on your touch on local and indigenous knowledge, what would you say are the game changers that I must do quick?
I think the game changers come from two different areas, right? So it's a top down and bottom up at the same time. I think the bottom up one is for us to document those location specific successes in a way that more people can learn from it, right? And that sounds quite innocuous, but I'm using an example of the conservation agriculture in South Africa. Conservation agriculture in South Africa, the things that farmers do on a daily basis in pursuit of conservation agriculture are things that they've taught each other. Those are very informal, large communities, and they just get on and they do it. And they actually do show that they've got improved yields and improved long-term soil carbon profiles and improved water retention, improved drought resistance, and all the things that conservation agriculture is known for. And I use that as an opportunity, not because we didn't know that conservation agriculture works, but as an example of a community that through its practice engaged with. And I think there's a little bit of a runaway effect here. I think it's becoming quite widespread, and I think there's a lot of interest there. So it's about documenting these practices in that area and others, and showing that there's a bona fide financial reason to do this. I'm not saying it should be the only criteria to do it, but as far as low-hanging fruit's concerned, that would be one of the entry points. There are some environmental restoration activities that don't have an immediate financial benefit, right? And that's not where we want to start. Doesn't mean we don't want to do it. It means that for maximum action, it's not our starting point. That's the bottom up. The top-down initiatives, I see many very interesting international initiatives around reporting and financial risk auditing. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. I think those are risk frameworks that actually signal quite a large shift in how investors think about money and responsible investing. So if you read the small print, certainly the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures have moved the climate risk off the ESG table and moved it into the main balance statement, right? And that if you've got an accounting background, which I don't have, you'll know that's quite a large shift, because all of a sudden now, if you don't do this well, you're going to become liable as if you are not looking after your shareholders' money in the best possible manner. So that is the same as not looking after the climate risks, in this case, in the best possible manner. And I think the nature-related financial disclosure is going in the same direction. So I think somewhere along the line, these top-down policy instruments, clever ones, right, like the climate and the nature one, and documenting and expanding the bottom-up success stories, I think somewhere in the middle will meet and actually achieve the scaling that we want.
Excellent. I like the idea of documenting, and that exactly speaks to us as researchers, not just documenting in publications that are scientific and removed, but in policy briefs where we can have advisories of this works in country X, it's being done by community Y, they've done it for the past 50 years, and we've gone in as scientists to validate what they do and document it in a way that can communicate continent-wide and globally. I like the bit you say also on the new metrics, the measurements. I sit on a couple of those institutions whereby it's no longer just the sustainability committee that looks into these issues. It's the audit committee, because the remuneration and incentive for all staff is now benchmarked on what are you doing for the environment, which is a very good way of holding people accountable. So yes, and hopefully there's more coming. for accountability even at individual level. Let me pass on. My colleague Tembi mentioned she wants to come back to you on your PhD work. That still is the reference point. But let me move on to Tembi now, who wants to have a panel discussion on what she has heard from a practitioner's point of view. Over to you, Mrs. Mamakamba.
Thank you, Professor Spanda, and thank you, Prof. Erasmus, for that intervention. And thank you also to Peter for the presentation. I think at this point, I just want to transition to make this the people's conversation. So I want to then come to the participants now. I've been monitoring the chat. There have been some comments here and there. I'll pick them up. But before I move to the participants who are with us in the room today, I want to go to Dinko, Hanan Dinko, whose research focuses on climate change and natural resource management, and he has a particular interest in food and water security. His current work examines the socio-political dimensions of water use in local communities and how these interact with broader climate changes in producing outcomes for different segments of society. So when I met with Dinko, just to chat with him and also just to understand what he is doing, how it's relevant to CLAB, one of the things that I found interesting was that he has written a paper that's looking at unpacking dynamics of natural resource conflicts in Ghana, focusing specifically on the case of Rosewood, the land policy. And I thought I could actually pick his brain a bit and ask him to reflect on our thematic brief, the draft thematic brief that we welcome everyone to review, to say, having heard what Peter presented, Dinko, and also the intervention by Prof. Erasmus, what are we missing? Is there something that we have not quite touched on? Is there an area that we need to explore more? And what can you share from your experiences in documenting that Rosewood case?
Thank you. First of all, wonderful brief. I enjoyed reading it. And second of all, thanks to Prof. Erasmus and Peter for such a wonderful delivery. I think that most of the things that relates to land degradation has generally been covered, and Prof. Erasmus has done a great job by emphasizing the role of macro level, global level forces in driving local level land degradation. One thing I want to emphasize is the role of transnational capital in land degradation in Africa, especially in the case of Ghana, using Rosewood as a case study. Most often than not, we don't pay much attention. We pay much attention to the geopolitics of Chinese resource investment in Africa, but we do not pay a lot of attention to the environmental consequence of such investment. And one thing I want to emphasize is that transnational capital is essential in discussing land degradation in Africa. For instance, if you take Rosewood in northern Ghana, for instance, we have a lot of Chinese transnational capital flowing in as the Chinese economy has expanded over the past 20 years. There is a growing demand for certain luxury goods like antique furniture and others in China. And to meet that demand, China is turning to African countries to supply woods. And this also intersects with the declining soil quality and agricultural output as farmers are struggling, especially in semi-arid West Africa. And as return to agriculture is declining, people are turning away from subsistence farming to other sources of income. And that includes cutting down trees to provide logs for the Chinese demand. And in doing so, they end up degrading the environment. And what we have found is that the general decline in environmental quality over the past 30, 40 years has been exacerbated by this foreign capital investment in rosewood logging in West Africa. And so it is very important, if as we are discussing environmental degradation and biodiversity loss, it is very important to emphasize the role of transnational capital in that.
Thank you. I think that actually sort of fits in well with Prof. Erasmus' point around incentives that promote land degradation and the need to sort of have positive incentives. All right, so I think you have started us off by bringing in that sort of transnational capital element into the discussion. I also wonder, when you look at your water work as well, and how water is one of the sort of essential resources when we are talking about the environment. Do you have any reflections in that regard? You are muted, Dinko.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yes. I think that water is essential to environmental and land restoration. And I have seen firsthand how smallholder farmers are incorporating agroecological practices to revive land that has been degraded systematically. And as Prof. Erasmus has indicated, it is very important that we reflect back to some of these indigenous knowledge practices that farmers are returning to, and see how we can learn from some of these indigenous practices to improve soil water retention, soil water quality, as well as overall unleash the benefit of indigenous knowledge systems. So if you take, for instance, if you take Northern Ghana, we have farmers who are now not just applying fertilizer, but they are also using various natural resources to improve soil water quality and nutrients retention. And I have seen firsthand how they are using small scale irrigation practices to conserve water in soil, as well as improve crop production.
Okay, thank you. I think this actually leads me nicely to the point that was raised by Suelanji in the chat, where he's talking about agroecology as one of the innovations for land restoration. Suelanji, can you come in at this point? Would you want to share your reflections? I know Vela Gedze also then added to your comments there, but let me just open the floor for Suelanji.
Yeah, I would like to add my voice and reflection as well. The question that led me to think of innovations of agroecology is what traditional innovative methods that have been tested scientifically that can be used to scale up health practices of the soil and nutrient retention. So I thought of agroecology, which is which is one of innovation that provides ecological principles for the design of management of sustainable and resource conservation system. And it offers several advantages of over a conventional agronomic or industrial agriculture approach. So one of the advantages of using agroecology is that it relies on indigenous farming knowledge and selected minimal technologies. And some organizations like FAO have opened up an online platform where different stakeholders are coming online to share their indigenous knowledge of how to go about agroecology. There is a case of Tororo district in Uganda, where they are using urine to retain nutrients in gardens, and it has proven to be very effective, and farmers are retaining nutrients in their gardens and yielding more. So I think that's one of that's a contribution I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Surilanji, for that contribution and for sharing that example of what farmers are doing in other parts of the continent, like in Uganda. I see the comments are now coming fast and furious in the chat. We'll just keep maintaining that. Albert Manyani, I want to give you an opportunity to share your views on the subject as well. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Thank you very much for such a wonderful platform, wonderful presentations, which I've been just trying to make a follow-up. I've also realized that as we deliberate on these issues of land degradation, indeed, it is important to also understand that we live in different socio-economic environments in which you may find that the livelihoods which people do for their survival will actually lead them to exacerbate land degradation. For instance, I was been making a reference to poverty, which is a characteristic in most of the indigenous or in Africa. These end up leading people to venture into, say, the unwarranted and improper ways of extracting these natural resources. Like in some cases in Southern Africa, there's a lot of panning which goes on in terms of maybe it's mineral search, like gold panning. We have panning of diamonds and so forth. And all these activities are done not in a proper way, but people just want to make a living for the day. So you find it exacerbates this issue of land degradation. And so there is need actually to address the socio-economic variances or differences to assist the peasant farmers. Yes, the innovations are good and okay. We have read them, but now this poor man in the rural area doesn't have anything from where to start. And what is near to this peasant farmer is his land, a piece of land, and the resources which surround him. So you find the extraction is the one which actually exacerbates the situation of land degradation. I think that's my comment on this. So we need actually to look at various ways of addressing these imbalances or this issue of poverty. What can be done to our people so that they do not just rely on these natural resources, but as they rely on natural resources, they should extract them in a proper way.
Excellent point. Thank you, Albert, for that intervention. You are turning this discussion on its head and think about the people and where they come from. How do they make a living if they are not going to cut down trees as we had to make furniture that they then sell to the Chinese market, or if they're not going to try and dig for gold on their fields. So the issue of addressing the socio-economic challenges as we think about the environment is a key one. We have another question that has come through the chat from Vinesh Maharaj. He's saying, how do we look at the protection and safeguarding of IKS? Or is it meant to be freely available to the public? Can we put IP on IKS? Can we protect our indigenous knowledge? Can we protect farmers when they when they use certain methods and say this is not to be used without patents and without, how do we protect IKS? Is it free for all? Is it supposed to be just taken and used by anyone anyhow? Or do we need to look at how we protect IKS? I think there is a question there that I would like to pause with the group. If anyone wants to come in and respond to that, please do come in. I also want our speakers as well, our panelists, to think about it and maybe reflect on it. Thank you very much, I think, for all of the contributions that have come through the chat and really, really digging deep into this issue of land degradation and biodiversity preservation. At this point, I think we have just gone past the quarter of the hour. We are left with 15 minutes and we have to wrap up now, because the tradition has been that we don't hit the half-hour mark, but we try and finish before, to give people allowance to transition to their next meetings or their next sessions that they are attending. Let me, before I hand over to Professor Sibanda, let me come back to Prof. Erasmus on your thesis. It's years later. I would not want to imagine how long ago you got your PhD, but your paper is still one of the most cited and one of the most relevant to date. My question is, do we have enough research coming out in this area? Are we not grooming enough people in this space to be able to talk about this? I think when Prof. Sibanda introduced the session and spoke about the number of people that have registered in comparison to the people we have had attending previous sessions, I think she made a sort of comment that perhaps people are not sure what land degradation and biodiversity is all about. So I don't know if you have any reflections about that.
I think, thanks, I'll be quick. I think the biodiversity research is still primarily conducted from the traditional natural sciences, people with a botany and a zoology background. Like, I mean, my degree's in zoology, right? That's where I come from. And I think that, I mean, that has, it's not right or wrong. I think that that's just how it's evolved. I think that's a little bit different to the other area that I'm familiar with, climate change. I think climate change impacts and adaptation and mitigation has converged, that you've got a lot more disciplines represented at quite a mature level trying to solve the problems of the day. My interpretation is that we still have, that the people engaged with biodiversity research are still people primarily from those disciplinary backgrounds. Doesn't mean that they don't know how the finance world works or what international market instruments might be, but I don't think they've had the traction yet in the other areas where a lot of I mean, I'm of the personal opinion that a lot of the big changes happen if you can pull financial levers and you can pull legal levers. And I think that may have been just, maybe those levers are not as easily accessible for those sorts of research communities. I think it is changing, and I'm open to other ideas here. This is just off the top of my head how I think about it. I hope I'm wrong. I know it's developing, but it needs to be a little bit quicker. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof, for that reflection. Maybe our speakers as well. I would like to go to Peter, and I also like to go to Dinko for final reflections, and then hand over to Professor Sibanda. Peter, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. As indicated in the presentation, it is time for African countries to look at how we are going to holistically and sustainably address land degradation, because if we don't do that, the impact is that we are going to have the greatest impact on our lives. Our food systems, our livelihoods, our health systems are going to be affected. So it is time we come together to look at innovative ways, combining policy, practice, and indigenous livelihood or indigenous knowledge system to address the issue of land degradation in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that comment. We need to work across disciplines to make sure that we address one of the greatest challenges of our time. Dinko, over to you. Any final words, reflections?
Thank you. I think that we have seen various instances where indigenous systems, knowledge system works. We have an opportunity to build on that and scale it up. Let's build on what works and move away from what has historically not been beneficial to the environment. And I believe that indigenous knowledge systems is very crucial going forward.
Thank you, Dingo, for the reflection. Prof. Erasmus has put a comment to say nature for development approaches has so many core benefits for people and the planet that there is no longer any excuse to have nature agnostic projects. Thank you for that comment. I think for me, Prof. Erasmus, my take home message from your intervention earlier is that when you ask the question, how do we make it happen? You said scale, context, and local nuances. That's what we need to take into account. Thank you so much to all our speakers. Let me hand over now to Professor Spanda.
Thank you very much for that rich, in-depth discussion on a subject that is owned by a few but affects many. So we hope as we package the policy brief, you are going to accompany us to sharpen it so that we can bring in more actors into this space. Colleagues, as I said, this is 4 of number 4. We are now going to be changing gear and moving into the regions. My colleague is projecting the dates that we have set up for the regional dialogues. We're going to start in West Africa, 6th of June, East Africa, 7th, North Africa, 8, Central Africa, 9, and then Southern Africa, 10. Why are we going into the regions? I think we've just summarized it. Get the knowledge, adapt it locally, contextualize, look for the local nuances. We are packaging thematic policy briefs, but we hope for all the 4 webinars and the thematic papers we have written, we can distill these into local contexts. Our policymakers will only act if they can see Zai method in West Africa. They will say, I grew up doing Zai and I know how to do it and I know it's climate smart. Your policymakers in another region will also be looking for local context and specific examples from their region that they want to take to scale. So that's the reason why we are doing these regional webinars. Now, who are the best messengers? I'm appealing to you today to submit your names for each of the regions. Yes, we've got a database, thanks to Fanapan, who've kept a database of practitioners across all areas, but we now want to make sure the messengers are from each of the regions. When we do West Africa, we would like to hear the voice of ECOWAS, would like to hear the voice of institutions in West Africa and the champions. Who are those champions? It's researchers, it's farmers, it's private sector, it's non-governmental organizations, but most important, our negotiators and our authors for the different global policy frameworks that are guiding our work. So please help us find these jewels who are going to be in our database and are going to be the messengers who carry the message across. So I leave you with a challenge, and I thank you for everything you've done, particularly those who've joined us from webinar 1, 2, 3, and 4. And just to remind you, the work is not over. We meet on the 6th and go a deep dive, intense discussion for each region, putting together all the 4 thematic briefs and contextualizing them into the region. We're looking for authors, we're looking for messengers, we're also looking for people who will be the champions to follow through after each webinar. It's not a talk shop. It's meant to be a practical journey that we continuously walk until we achieve our impact that we desire and define for ourselves. Mine is to thank you. You've got our contacts. Do send your emails to CLAB Future Africa, and we will engage with you and guide you and partner with you as we prepare for the regional webinars. Thank you to our panelists for today's session. Thank you to our moderator, and behind the scenes, our IT team and marketing, social marketing team that has been supporting this work. As always, you have the last 4 minutes to transition to your next meeting. Thank you for your time.
Thank you to Prof. And thanks for everybody.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Bye-bye.